Councilmember Ritchie Torres, thank you so much for joining us. You look great. I'm going to quickly tell everyone what Zioness is. If anybody who's watching isn't already involved in Zioness, we hope you'll get involved. Zioness is a coalition of activists and allies, American Jews and our allies who want to be involved in progressive activism, who want to fight for social and racial and economic and gender justice in America, who want to do it without checking any piece of our Jewish or Zionist identity at the door, want to stand proud with all of our authentic selves while we fight for the progressive movement and the advancement of the progressive agenda in America. And Councilmember Ritchie Torres has been an ally since we first met. It feels like a lifetime ago. It was actually only like 16 months ago. And we've done so much together. The Councilmember marched with the Zionist contingent at the anti-Semitism rally in January of this year after the horrific attack in Muncie, and has, participated in Zionist events and really stood in solidarity with the Jewish community on so many issues for quite a long time. He is the youngest elected official ever from the Bronx, the first openly gay elected official from the Bronx, the youngest ever city council member in New York City. He has overcome so much to be in the position he's in, and I hope that his career will advance leaps and bounds. Zioness is a 501c3 organization and cannot endorse or oppose candidates for public office. The council member is running for Congress. We wish him luck. We also wish his opponents luck. And we are really thrilled that you are here in your capacity as a very active leader in the New York City Council and in the Bronx community, where you live and work and represent your constituents very passionately. So we are so grateful for everyone who is joining for this conversation. It's one of the most important that we're having in the social differencing series that Zioness launched last week to provide action items for people who are lucky enough to be safe at home, privileged enough to have safety and security and jobs, where we can work from home. That is such a luxury right now in this moment. There are so many vulnerable the same people who were vulnerable before coronavirus are extra vulnerable now. So many people need our help. And so many of us, we're looking for ways that we can be most effective in, addressing some of the challenges that are affecting vulnerable communities right now. And so this social differencing series is a way, continues to be a way for Zionist activists across the country to, to take action, to feel like we have some agency where we can learn about, some of the problems and find ways to help. So this conversation is focused on communities of color, which are disproportionately affected by coronavirus across the board. The death rate is astronomically higher in the African-American community and the Latino community, both of which the council member represents. We are also going to talk about food insecurity, mental health issues, and really just whatever else comes up. So please feel free to share questions in the Q&A box. If you're watching on Facebook, you can also put a question on the stream on Facebook, and we'll be monitoring those. And we really want this to be a dialogue. And I know the council member is always open to these kinds of conversations. So thank you again. You're wonderful to join us.
It's an honor to be with you. So
you're the best. First and foremost, as someone who was diagnosed with COVID early on in this process, it feels like so long ago that you were diagnosed, even though we've only been in this isolation period for 5 or 6 weeks in New York City. Thank God you're okay. Tell us about your experience and your staff and your fears. I know you had a lot of fears relating to your mom and, the people that you had been around. So if you don't mind, just tell us how it all went and, what people should expect if they do get sick.
No, of course. Well, first of all, thank you, Amanda, for having me. I'm a great admirer of yours and Zioness, and I feel like your advocacy is filling a critical void in American politics and in American discourse. So as you said, I had COVID-19. The experience of COVID-19 can vary widely from person to person, right? There are those who are asymptomatic, and then there are those who die from COVID-19. I had a fever, a cough, but I was able to manage my symptoms without hospitalization. As I grew up in public housing, so I have a history of asthma. As a child, it was so severe that I would go in and out of the emergency room. but thankfully I had no trouble breathing. I had none of the worst respiratory symptoms that have been come to be identified with COVID-19. One of my staffers was infected as well. He had more serious symptoms, and at one point he lost his sense of smell and taste, but the two of us have fully recovered.
Thank God. So I don't know, what topic should we start with? Should we talk about communities of color?
I just want to quick, as someone who has recovered, I wish I had the ability to donate blood, but I'm prohibited by federal law from donating blood. If I, as someone who's LGBTQ, one blood donation can save up to 3 lives. And New York State is pursuing what is known as convalescent blood plasma transfusions as a treatment for COVID-19. The idea is to extract antibodies from the blood of those who have recovered, like me, and then inject it into the blood of those who are ill in the hopes of fighting the infection and aiding recovery. And I'm prohibited by law from contributing blood to those who need it and to those whose lives depend on it. And that's a 20th century policy that we must desperately overturn. There's no, the FDA should be evaluating risk on an individual basis. It should not be stigmatizing whole classes of people like the LGBTQ community.
Yeah, so this is such an important point, and I'm glad you brought it up and that we're starting with it. Can you talk, for people who aren't familiar with what you're talking about, can you explain where this policy started? I know there was some reassessment of the policy over the last couple of weeks because of, the coronavirus. Can you give a little background for people who are watching?
Yeah, so if you are an LGBTQ male, a male who has sex with male, you are prohibited from donating blood unless you've been celibate for a year. The FDA has since revised the policy to 3 months. You have to remain celibate for 3 months, although my understanding is that the blood centers continue to apply the original year-long ban, but it has the practical effect of prohibiting the vast majority of LGBTQ survivors from donating blood at a time when the shortages have never been more dire. And there's no scientific basis behind it whatsoever. Every person who gives a blood donation, the blood is screened for viruses.
Right.
So whether you're LGBTQ or straight, if you have HIV in your blood, you're going to be prohibited. It's not going to be used for convalescent blood plasma transfusion.
Right. And I was reading up on this today, knowing we were going to talk about it, and I read that we're in a massive, we have a massive dearth of blood available. People are saying home blood drives are shutting down. Obviously, there are a lot of patients that need blood, so our blood banks are dangerously low, and there are people who, could help, particularly with coronavirus patients. And with antibody testing and stuff like that. But even beyond that, I mean, there are still shootings, there are still car accidents, there are still, lots of medical emergencies that require blood. And to, to deny that people who are good-hearted enough to give blood in the first place, that they're not allowed to do so because they're members of the LGBTQ community, is horrifying. That's still a policy, that it was ever a policy on the books, but that it remains a policy on the books is something difficult to wrap your head around. Are there anything, any steps that Zionist activists can take? I know this is a national policy. Are there different states? You said the blood banks are not following the new policy, which is 3 months instead of a year. I know the 3 months is not very practical either, but I don't know, maybe if people were sick, I don't know. Is there anything that our activists can do, call their representatives, how do we force the FDA to reassess this? And has it been a partisan issue in terms of, FDA consideration over the years?
It has been. I mean, Republican, although keep in mind the latest policy dates back to the Obama administration. My understanding is before the Obama administration, it was an outright ban. And then the Obama administration imposed a time limit, which was seen as an improvement, but I see it as a continuation of discrimination against the LGBTQ community. And as you said, we're living in a time when there's a dangerous shortage of blood. We have an infectious disease outbreak. We do not have a vaccine. We do not have an antiviral. Convalescent blood plasma transfusions is one of the few treatments that we have for COVID-19.
That actually saves lives.
Yes, that has the potential to save lives.
Yeah.
And it's inexplicable to me that we're putting stigma ahead of science.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any screening for non-LGBTQ people? Is there any time or specific?
No, there's no, although everyone is subject to screening. So
right.
If you have a sexually transmitted disease, or if you have any virus,
your blood will.
And exactly right. No one's going to put to use blood that has other viruses.
This is not relevant. I'm just curious. This isn't relevant to how horrific this policy is, but I'm just curious. How do they know that someone is LGBTQ?
You would disclose it.
You would have to sign saying that you're an SM, a man who has sex with men.
Exactly right. And as a matter of integrity, I would disclose it because if I'm contributing blood, I want to do so under, I would refuse to do so under false pretenses.
No, of course. I mean, of course, you're not going to sign something that's not true. I would never suggest that you do something like that. It just, I don't know that, would I have to sign something that I'm not LGBTQ?
You would have to disclose it, yeah.
Okay. So horrific. Yeah. Well, thank you for your willingness to donate blood to save lives. And, after what you've already been through, having had COVID, that now you want to help others just is a testament to who you are as a person, which is why I'm so grateful for your leadership. So, along the same lines, there are so many people who are deathly ill right now. There are so many people who are most vulnerable to this virus. There are communities that have, low access to quality healthcare, who have healthcare, most people have healthcare tied to their jobs. People are losing jobs at rates, I think, higher than the Great Depression at this point. The people who don't have quality healthcare and haven't had quality healthcare, haven't had access to preventative care, have much more liability or much more vulnerability to pre-existing conditions that end up being comorbidities when it comes to a positive diagnosis when it comes to COVID-19. So we've learned a lot over the past few weeks. I don't think we have the data that we need right now, but I know, it's been widely reported that the African-American community and communities of color are particularly vulnerable at astronomical rates to this disease. Before some of these statistics were coming out, there were a lot of conversations happening that, we're all in this together. We're all equally vulnerable, rich people, poor people, white people, Black people, brown people, we're all vulnerable. This is a threat that crosses all borders. But, of course, we're learning that that's just not true. So, do you have any specific ideas? I know you have a big career in front of you. You have federal ambitions. Do you have any specific ideas for how we could address this crisis in terms of health inequality? I'm sure you've been thinking about it. Where is the first place we should start with this conversation? It's obviously a huge conversation, and we would need the political will and the political courage to pursue the changes that we need. But where would you start?
Well, I agree with the premise of your question. New York City's been the outbreak of the coronavirus, has been the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak in the United States. And within New York City, the two hospitals that have been hardest hit one is Elmhurst, which serves the highest population of undocumented immigrants, and then Lincoln in the South Bronx, which serves the highest population of low-income New Yorkers. It's true that the coronavirus outbreaks affects all of us, but it affects us unevenly. I often say there's no single curve to flatten in New York City. There are multiple curves, and communities of color, the lowest income communities, are on the deadliest curve. When it comes to age-adjusted death rate, African Americans and Latinos have twice the likelihood of dying from COVID-19, right? Or take the Bronx. If you compare the Bronx to Manhattan, even though Manhattan has a substantially larger population than the Bronx has more than double the number of fatalities. As you pointed out, almost all of the fatalities of COVID-19 have at least one comorbidity. and the two most common comorbidities are hypertension and diabetes. The rates of hypertension are 3 times higher in the South Bronx than in the financial district of Manhattan. The rates of diabetes more than 5 times higher in the South Bronx than in the financial district in Manhattan. And then there's research that pollution, that if you're exposed to environmental toxins, then you're predisposed to the worst effects of COVID-19, right? So there are multiple senses in which low-income communities, communities of color are especially vulnerable. And it comes down to a lack of a comprehensive social safety net. You know, the United States is the only country in the industrialized world that fails to provide public goods like childcare, universal health care, paid sick time that are taken for granted in the rest of the industrialized world, especially in Western Europe and Scandinavia. And so if we had a comprehensive social safety net, communities of color would be in a much stronger position to weather the worst effects of COVID-19.
So where would you begin? You know, if you were in charge, where do we begin to?
One is healthcare. Like, we need proper funding for our healthcare system. You know, the New York CARES Act does an enormous disservice to New York City in general and the Bronx in particular. So within the New York CARES Act, there's about $100 billion in funding for, the US CARES Act. There's about $100 million in funding for hospitals. The federal government's formula for dispersing COVID-19 funding does not even factor in the actual number of COVID-19 cases. It only considers one variable, which is the number of Medicare fee-for-service recipients. So if you're a safety net hospital like St. Barnabas or Lincoln in the Bronx, and you have some of the highest incidence of COVID-19 cases with some of the worst outcomes, and you have primarily Medicaid patients rather than Medicare, and you have primarily Medicare Advantage rather than Medicare fee-for-service, you're receiving far less funding than less needy hospitals elsewhere in the country. I mean, to give you a more concrete example, St. Barnabas is going to receive about $3.5 million from the federal government. $3.5 million is what St. Barnabas has spent in a half a week in the midst of the COVID-19 outbreak. So the support from the federal government has added insult to injury.
So we did a webinar last week with Congresswoman Nita Lowey, and we were talking, for those who don't know, the CARES Act that the Councilmember was talking about is the third stimulus package, the third relief package related to coronavirus on a federal level. There are debates right now ongoing about a fourth stimulus package, and there are some pretty urgent issues that make it seem, I think, more today than it did on Thursday when we did this webinar with the Congresswoman, like there will be a fourth package. For example, the SBA loans, which were extremely popular and critical, there was $350 billion allocated, and that fund has already been used up. So there's a conversation, an urgent conversation happening about replenishing that pool so that small businesses and nonprofits can apply and can keep people on the payroll as we weather the storm. So I'm hoping that there is a fourth relief bill coming soon from the federal government. And the Congresswoman mentioned specifically that there was a battle over funding for hospitals. So this, I mean, it's shocking and outrageous that this wouldn't be the primary issue that's coming from the federal government right now. But I guess it's not shocking that the way that the federal government is allocating that money is not, fair. It's not going to the hospitals that need it most. It's not, the allocation is not happening in a way that makes any sense. But so going back, so you were talking about healthcare, and we got into hospitals, but going to the healthcare debate and, healthcare being tied to employment, the fact that so many Americans are still, even after Obamacare, uninsured. The federal government actually, I think a couple of weeks ago, I don't remember exactly the details, but you might decline to have another open enrollment window for Obamacare, despite the fact that so many Americans were losing their health insurance because they were losing their jobs. So, how do we first of all, do you think that this might open up a new conversation in the election right now? I know it was a huge part of the conversation in the Democratic primaries. Now there is a Democratic presumptive nominee. Do you think that Americans are going to be more open to a conversation of, universal healthcare or a public option now, given the coronavirus crisis and the fact that so many people are uninsured?
I'm cautiously optimistic that a post-COVID-19 world will see the wisdom of universal healthcare and a comprehensive social safety net. There's a newfound appreciation for the sacrifices of the essential workforce, which includes but is not limited to our healthcare workers.
Yeah.
Well, I think the best way to show our appreciation is to ensure that those workers have access to decent wages and decent benefits, which includes healthcare. I mean, healthcare should be codified as a right, because without access to preventative care, you have a greater risk of developing chronic conditions that will worsen over time, and that puts you at greater risk of death or serious illness from COVID-19.
Yeah. Isn't it crazy that we live in America and it's really every day more and more astonishing?
We're the wealthiest country in the world, and yet we fail to provide some of our most essential workers with essential public goods like healthcare. And it's unacceptable, and I hope that we can learn from the coronavirus experience to emerge as a more decent society. And one more piece too, there's, beyond one more reason for the disparities in the death rate. Not only do communities of color have higher rates of poverty and pollution and a greater prevalence of pre-existing conditions, but also have greater representation in the frontline workforce. Right? Our society has essentially been split into two, right? There are the frontline workers who are risking their lives in the midst of an infectious disease outbreak. And then there's everyone else who has the luxury of staying at home and practicing social distancing. But that luxury is made possible by the frontline workers, right, who are risking their lives and who often live in places like the Bronx. And there have been reports that if you're exposed to a higher dose of the virus, then it might cause you to develop a more severe manifestation of the virus, the disease. So if you are a frontline healthcare worker who has no personal protective equipment and you're surrounded by COVID-19 patients, you're at a much higher risk of high dose infection and COVID-19 morbidity and mortality. And there should be some appreciation for the sacrifices that those frontline workers are making.
Yeah, something more than cheering out of our windows at 7 p.m., which is lovely and meaningful. But
I actually think the federal government, some of the funding in the stimulus package should go toward hazard pay. Hazard pay. So we should we should provide hazard pay to frontline workers in recognition of the sacrifices that they're making. Because it's a terrifying experience. Imagine you're a healthcare worker, you're surrounded by patients, and then you have to return home where you run the risk of infecting your own family. And often, if you're a low-income New Yorker, you're living in overcrowded conditions.
Right.
Where families are doubling up or tripling up. You might not have no room of your own. So, I know we tell everyone to practice social distancing, and that's critically important. But if you live in an overcrowded apartment, or if you're riding an overcrowded subway, you might not have the luxury of practicing social distancing.
Right. It's not a coincidence that New York City is the fourth most population dense city in America, and that we're. But
that density is not evenly distributed. Like it's one thing to live in a densely populated city. It's something else to live in an overcrowded apartment,
right?
Which could easily become a petri dish. I mean, keep in mind that we think of our homes as a safeguard against infectious disease outbreak, but the truth is, household transmission is a driver of coronavirus spread. In China, 75 to 80% of the cases transpired within family clusters. And so if you are confirmed or presumed to have the coronavirus, sending you home where you can infect the rest of your family is at some level dangerous and irresponsible. The city early on should have repurposed hotels as quarantine centers and isolation centers, and should have given people the option voluntarily of going to those centers and avoiding the risk of infecting their families.
Yeah, they're doing it now. No, is it? I don't know if it's
it's finally happening now, but we're a month into the
right,
outbreak.
right. And of course, in lower income communities, there are people who are taking care of their parents, who are part of vulnerable populations. So they're not just coming home and infecting their families; they're coming home and infecting the most vulnerable people in our society. So who have nowhere else to go. So
which is terrifying.
Terrifying. And
I mean, I am apprehensive about seeing my mother in person.
I know.
Because she's 60, has hypertension, which is the central comorbidity, COVID-19 comorbidity. And, I have not been able to take an antibody test that confirms that I'm immune. And I've heard some reports about reinfection or virus reactivation. So, like living with COVID-19 is like navigating the fog of war. And, the uncertainty is inhibiting me from seeing my own mother in person because I don't want to run the risk of infecting, the person who matters most to me.
I know the feeling. I also haven't seen my mom. I don't know whether I was sick, but it's scary. And well, first of all, I wanted to go back to something that we were talking about before when you were talking about a social safety net. That is a term that we throw around a lot, but I was hoping you could talk specifically about what it would look like to have a comprehensive social safety net. What are the issues that, we should be focusing on most to make sure that the vulnerable communities, not just to COVID, but, when we come out of this, as you said earlier, we hope that this will be an opportunity to come out stronger in our society. And there are a lot of, I hate to say positive things, because this is obviously a terrible situation across the board. But when we look at environmental effects, of the whole world staying home, when we think about people being open to, healthcare options that were previously not on the table, when we think about the very clear, unequivocal illustration of the haves and have-nots in our society right now, the people who are considered essential that previously didn't get a lot of attention. There are opportunities to actually come out and change the world that we live in. So, going back to, the question of what we should focus on, what would be the top priorities, like the three things that you think would be the place we would begin to build the social safety net that we need?
For me, the most important issues are, one is healthcare, which speaks for itself. Everyone should have access to healthcare. We might debate what form universal healthcare can take, but there should be no debating the need to provide everyone with access. There are some public goods that are so fundamental that everyone should have access to them, and healthcare is foremost among them. Second is housing. The central emotion of our time is the fear of displacement from one's community, from one's home. We're facing the greatest affordability crisis in New York City since the Great Depression. Every family in need should have access to affordable housing. I would love to see the creation of a housing voucher program or housing tax credit program that ensures that every low-income family pays no more than 30% of their income toward their rent. Here in New York City, 60,000 individuals are in the shelter system, a third of whom are children.
I was just
so there are children who are growing up in the wealthiest city in the world who have never known life outside of shelter. And beyond the shelter census, there are more than 100,000 children who are homeless in our school system. And so imagine if you're a child who's lurching from one shelter to the next, from one school to the next, who lacks stability in his or her life. How can you be expected to succeed academically under conditions of housing instability and food instability and healthcare instability? And so I see it as the obligation of government to provide people with fundamental public goods, because these are the foundations on which you can build a better life for yourself and your family, on which you can achieve your vision of the American dream. I had the opportunity to grow up in public housing. I had many challenges on my life, whether it was asthma or depression or poverty or violence. But the one constant that I had was a home, an affordable home, a stable home. And if it were not for public housing and the stability it gave me and my family, I would not be here today. I would not have become the youngest member of the city council at age 25 in 2013. That was made possible by the social safety net.
You are extraordinary. So we talked a little bit about kids, homeless kids, and kids in shelters, and food insecurity. These kids are getting their food at schools, and school is canceled for good reason. And it was a huge debate. There was a big debate between the mayor and the governor in New York about whether or not to close the schools. Huge debate among citizens of New York, whether schools should be closed, whether, kids who are mostly not vulnerable, or at least not exhibiting the symptoms, but may likely be carriers of COVID-19, whether it's safe to keep them going to school, or whether it's a better idea than having them home and having parents homeschooling them and, trying to keep their jobs and feeding them. I forget what the numbers are. It's not most, some huge number, you might know, Ritchie, how many kids get one hot meal a day and it's at school. So they're not getting them right now. I know that New York State created a system where kids can go to their schools and pick up food. And, I'm wondering if you as a member of the city council can talk a little bit more about what opportunities are out there for kids who are hungry and families who are hungry in New York. And if on a national level of any organizations that you personally feel really connected to, I have a list of organizations doing amazing work, and we're going to send it out in an email to thank everyone for joining. So if you're watching on Facebook, just shoot us an email if you want this list at about@zioness.org and say, please send me the follow-up email to this webinar. There are some extraordinary organizations addressing food insecurity, but if you've been watching on the news, you see the lines at food banks around the country, in cities, in rural communities. It doesn't matter. People are starving and they're going looking for food. And it's not because there's a shortage of food supply. It's because the chain is broken because so many people are getting sick. And so Zion is actually working with our partners at Israel Aid in California to bring activists out. They get, they get protective gear. Everyone is social distancing. If you are watching from California, please also reach out to us. You can email me directly at amanda@zioness.org, and we can help you get stations at a food bank. It's super easy, just, boxing food so that it can be distributed to hungry people. But Ritchie, going back to you, if you could talk a little bit about how New York is addressing food insecurity, and again, if there are any, specific organizations doing work that you feel really passionate about on that issue.
Yeah. Well, I want to just make a broader point about some of the inequalities that have come to light, and then I will speak specifically about food. But, we had, in New York City, we had no choice but to shut down the city, right? We either had to act aggressively to stall the spread of the virus, or else the sheer number of coronavirus cases would have destabilized the healthcare system. But shutting down the city had devastating consequences for communities of color. Because if you shut down the schools, low-income families cannot afford childcare. Not every household has access to the internet, which enables distance learning. Or take the stimulus package. The stimulus package is going to send checks primarily through direct deposit. Not every family has a bank account. So families without bank accounts will have to wait longer to receive income to pay their rent and to pay their bills. So there are various ways in which the outbreak has revealed deeper inequalities in American life, whether it's the digital divide, food insecurity, lack of childcare, underbanking. Like, all of these issues have been encapsulated within the experience of COVID-19. Specifically on food, the most challenging weeks were the first weeks in mid-March. We saw a collapse of about a third of the food pantries in New York City, because the food pantries had fewer volunteers who tend to be older and who were staying at home out of fear of the coronavirus. There was an increase in demand. There was an increase in food pricing. It could have been because of disruptions in the supply chain or predatory pricing. But if you're a food bank or a food pantry, you're in no position to compete with the likes, the multi-billion-dollar behemoths like Amazon and Walmart. So that competition was dramatically driving up the price of food. and that was putting enormous strain on the food system here in New York City. Thankfully, we were able to intervene and invest about $25 million in emergency funding in food banks. The state did the same, so there's been an emergency infusion of about $50 million in funds. In addition, the city has established hundreds of meal hubs that allow families to pick up 3 meals a day from Monday to Friday from 7:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. So schools have been repurposed into meal hubs, and it's available to every New Yorker, regardless of income, regardless of immigration status, regardless of whether you have children. Any New Yorker can go to a meal hub and pick up to 3 meals a day. And then we also have a meal delivery program for senior citizens. So if you're a senior citizen who's bound to your house, you can call 311 and arrange for food delivery.
I didn't know that. All of that.
Yeah.
Amazing.
But it took about a month for the city to create a whole new infrastructure for delivering food to families in need. But the first few weeks were brutal. And there were people who were on the verge of destitution and starvation. The situation is much more stable now, but look, the families are facing a real crisis of food instability. You know, in the city council, I had a role in securing $1 million for CUNY students. So there are CUNY students who do not qualify for SNAP, for food stamps, who do not qualify for the National School Lunch Program, which is reserved only for K-12 education.
Which, by the way, that was the number that I was thinking about before. It's almost 30 million children that are part of the National School Lunch Program. So,
right. But there are college students who do not have access to the National School Lunch Program, who do not have access to SNAP, who need funding for food. And so we created a fund specifically for those students. And those students could be single moms who are raising multiple children, who are working during the day and going to school at night and need funding to feed themselves and their families.
It's crazy how many holes there are.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up SNAP, because there was a huge debate also in the CARES Act relating to SNAP. And I think they got $15 billion for SNAP, but it wasn't actually increasing the pool of available funds. It was increasing the amount that people who are already part of the program can get, but it wasn't actually increasing availability of SNAP funds for new people. And there are so many new people who are hungry now who apparently. So I know this was also a huge debate in the third bill, and something that people will be debating, you know, that federal legislators will be debating in the fourth bill. But I guess I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that, you know, on the SNAP issue and how we deal with this partisan gridlock, that, you know, something like that, like feeding Americans, would be something that we can't come to consensus on. And given your leadership on so many issues, you know, what would you recommend to people who are following these issues in terms of action steps that we can take to push legislators? Even, you know, I live in New York, so my representatives are all fighting for these issues, but for people who live in other states, what messages should they be sharing, not just with their elected officials, but with other people who maybe don't share their views, don't know that much about these issues? Do you have any, you know, simple advice for people to make a difference here, you know, on these simple issues that matter so much?
I mean, even though Zioness is a 501c3, my main recommendation is to elect progressive Democrats who actually believe that access to food is a fundamental right. Because, as you said, it should be non-negotiable. There's nothing partisan about ensuring that people who lost their jobs, largely through no fault of their own, right? No one could have seen the coronavirus coming and the catastrophic consequences it has had for the economy and the need to shut down the economy. And so we have an obligation to those families to provide them with relief, whether it's rental assistance or food assistance or general income support. It would be immoral and unwise for us to allow families to starve simply on the basis of partisan politics. There's no excuse for
I'm smiling because it's nothing about this is funny. But we did a Shabbat event on Friday night with Attorney General Tish James, and she made a similar comment. And I said, we are a 501c3. We can't endorse or oppose candidates for public office. But for the record, New York nonprofits, the Charities Bureau is under the purview of the Attorney General's office. So if Tish is allowed to say it and you're allowed to say it, I can't get in trouble for it. So that's, it wasn't Zionist. It was elected saying what they want to say about their own.
My only basic point is the people we elect, it matters. It has implications for public policy. And there's nothing like an infectious disease outbreak to demonstrate the need for a social safety net that catches people when they fall. And all of us can fall. All of us are one tragedy away from losing everything in our lives. And we should have enough compassion to ensure that there's a safety net that catches other people when they fall.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's not a partisan comment to say people should be thinking about the issues that matter to them. People should be thinking about the communities that matter to them, the human beings who are facing unimaginable challenges, and think about, how to be politically active to represent all of those values. And that's not a partisan thing. Choose your issue, choose your people that you want to vote for and fight for, and, and that you want to communicate with on issues that matter to you. But there's never been a more important time to be politically active. And I know everyone has said that every time they've ever, thought about political activism. But if you look at the world right now, I think it's pretty clear there has really never been a more important time. Ritchie, I wanted to talk a little bit about mental health. Under Obamacare, there was a conversation about Medicaid expansion, and it became a choice for states whether they wanted to enroll in Medicaid expansion. Medicaid is particularly relevant for people who are suffering from mental health issues, and for people who live in states that have not opted to expand Medicaid. Do you know of any free or affordable resources for people suffering from mental health issues where they could seek assistance or treatment? And, along the same lines, not exactly, but, in a broader sense, there was a loneliness epidemic long before coronavirus. And there are actually studies that I've read recently about how loneliness can actually affect lifespan. Who are lonely are living for less time. And this is something, I think in the UK, they actually created like a loneliness commission in the government to study this and, to try to find ways to connect people. And, in this moment where we're all socially or at least physically distanced, what would you share as someone who has suffered from mental health issues in terms of resources, just in terms of ways to think, ways to get yourself out of bed and pick yourself up and feel better, whether you need, actual care or not?
So there is such a severe lack of access to mental health care, especially in places like the Bronx. I have struggled with depression my whole life, but thankfully I had the opportunity to see a psychiatrist, to take medication, and it's enabled me to become not only a productive law-abiding citizen, but also an effective member of the city council. So I'm a believer in the transformative power of mental health treatment. But the reality is there are real barriers to accessing mental health care, especially in communities of color. There's a shortage of psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers. There's a lack of funding. Thankfully, here in New York City, we do have the public hospital system, Health and Hospitals, which provides healthcare regardless of your ability today and regardless of your immigration status. And so if you ever have any troubles with mental health, if you have suicidal ideation, you should definitely reach out to Health and Hospitals. Both the state and the city have hotlines specifically oriented toward mental health. I believe the city hotline is 188 New York's NYC Well. But as you said, the epidemic of loneliness affecting our society can be deadly. And we have to drive home the message that social distancing need not mean the absence of social connection. we all have an obligation to check in with our friends and to remain connected to them and remain emotionally supportive of them. Because a home quarantine can take a psychological toll, especially on those of us that struggle with depression. And I worry especially for senior citizens. Like if you're a senior citizen who has no family, if you're living, you often look to a senior center as a second family, as a second home. And to see that closed and shuttered, that could be a deeply traumatic event for a senior citizen. And so we have to do everything we can to check in with senior. I have my office prioritize wellness calls, make wellness calls to every senior in my district, let them know that we're here to support them, that we're here to provide whatever resources that are available.
Thank you.
And I see someone is saying, are we going to be able to ask questions?
Yes. I just feel like I could talk to you for so long. Checking to make sure that all of my most important questions were asked, and they mostly are. So there is a question in here about what the city council is going to be doing to stop people from illegally subletting their NYCHA apartments on Airbnb.
It is illegal to sublet a public housing unit for Airbnb. I consider it a theft of public resources, affordable housing that should go toward people in need. No one should profit from the use of public housing or affordable housing. And several months ago, I've asked the Inspector General for the New York City Housing Authority to investigate the practice of subletting in NYCHA housing. My understanding is that it's an isolated occurrence. It's not widespread, but even if it's only a few cases, it's a few cases too many, because every time you sublet or Airbnb a unit in public housing, you're effectively taking it out of your affordable housing stock.
Okay, so I just got a question on Facebook from a wonderful friend that I met at Tel Aviv Pride last year, Kenneth Romero, who is the executive director of the National Hispanic Caucus of State Legislators. It's amazing. And he asked, the $1,200 check doesn't go far in many places that Hispanics and other people of color live. The median rent in New York City, which is 29% Hispanic, is $1,997 a month. Shouldn't Congress account for cost of living in future relief payments, one that takes into consideration the urban or rural cost of living disparity?
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's one example of how the CARES Act, the federal stimulus package, does an enormous disservice to New York City, to places like the Bronx. $1,200 cannot even pay for the rent in most cases. Right? So a $1,200, and as I noted earlier, not every community in need is going to receive the $1,200 immediately. If you have no bank account, then you have to wait much longer.
Illegally subletting their. Sorry, I was looking for the questions on Facebook. Go ahead.
Then you're going to have to wait much longer to receive cash assistance. So I agree that we should distribute funds using a formula that accounts for the reality of local housing markets. We should not apply the same formula to New York City that you would apply to Nebraska. No offense to the people of Nebraska.
I have a question. There weren't any other questions, but if anyone has them, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box or the chat or comment on Facebook. I have a friend who is in the hospitality industry. She has a small restaurant in New York City. She's very connected to major restaurateurs, but they're not the, big business industry, not the McDonald's, but the independent restaurateurs who make up such a huge part of what New York City is and employ so many people. I think across the country, it was 15 million workers that are directly connected to the restaurant industry and hospitality industry. And that's not even going further into the supply chain for restaurants. And so many, a lot of restaurants in New York City are shut down. Many of them are providing delivery and pickup, but they're not doing the business that they used to do. I think there are rent abatements happening in New York City. I'm not exactly sure what the situation is in terms of small businesses needing to pay rent, but given that it seems like it's going to be a while until we're back in business, if we ever get back to what it used to be, is there anything that you would recommend the federal government do? I know they've been really trying to advocate for having a seat at the table in the relief package conversations, but they haven't had one. Independent restaurateurs actually have not had a seat at the table. Only, the real corporate giants have been at the table thus far. And given that this is such a New York City, and a huge industry that employs so many people in New York City, I don't know, do you have any thoughts on this specific issue, the restaurant industry?
No industry has been, beyond the hospitality industry, no industry has been hit harder than the restaurant industry. And, there's no telling how long the shutdown is going to last. And most businesses cannot survive a shutdown that unfolds over the course of several months. So I think it relates to the previous statement that was made. Just like we need to consider cost of living when providing aid to individuals, the same is true of businesses. Businesses in New York City pay much higher rent, pay much higher operating expenses than businesses elsewhere. And there needs to be a formula that factors in the reality of the New York City commercial rental market as well. So there's no question that restaurants have been hit particularly hard and need aid, or else many of these restaurants are going to collapse. And early reports indicate that New York City has received far less than its fair share of the small business aid. My understanding is the small business aid, the payroll protection program, has covered more than 80% of the payroll in businesses in Nebraska, but less than 40% in businesses in New York, even though New York has been the hardest hit epicenter in the country.
Really picking on Nebraska.
I don't know. Yeah. Well, Nebraska was number one, so that's why I'm picking on Nebraska.
I saw a list of the 50 states yesterday. Yeah. DC was ranked 49 in terms of PPP outcomes, in terms of businesses that applied and were granted. Yeah. New York City, I think, was also in the 40s somewhere. So, the last 20% of states in the country, despite, the many, many small businesses here and nonprofits, say. Do you think that's intentional? Is it related to anything? Is it because we have no real oversight of these funds, given that the president fired the person who was supposed to oversee the administration of funds under the CARES Act? I mean, do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, if I had to get, I think we have an administration that is far less sensitive to the needs of New York City than to the needs of red states. That would be my guess. But even if you're developing a neutral formula that treats every state equally, then it's destined to disadvantage New York, because we have a higher incidence of COVID-19 and we have greater needs when it comes to families and businesses. So we need to rethink the formula in light of local market realities, local cost of living. But no one can, we're in such dangerously uncharted territory that no one can tell you for sure what impact it's going to have on businesses. We might be practicing social distancing in some form for at least the next 2 years. It could take at least 2 years, not only to develop, but to mass produce and mass distribute a vaccine. And so in the meantime, the virus is going to keep spreading unless there's population immunity, and population immunity can only come from either widespread infection or widespread vaccination. And so in the absence of vaccination, we're going to be practicing varying forms of degrees of social distancing for the next 2 years. And there's no telling what kind of disruptive impact that will have on businesses in general and restaurants in particular. We're in dangerously uncharted territory, and it's going to be painful for government, for families, for businesses, and anyone who tells you otherwise is simply not telling the truth.
Okay, so we have one more question on that very upbeat note. There are a couple of different federal relief packages under consideration now by the Democratic caucus. One proposes monthly $2,000 payments to all Americans over 16. and the other proposes rent and mortgage forgiveness for the duration of the coronavirus crisis. Do you favor either one of these proposals more than the other? And if so, why? And I will preface this by saying, I don't know if you've been following these details, so if you haven't, no pressure.
I mean, I would support those programs, but I would prefer programs that adjust payments depending on cost of living, right? So if you're living in a more expensive city like New York, you ought to receive more support. It should be adjusted in light of cost of living. So that's the approach that I would prefer. I believe strongly that the federal government should issue emergency COVID-19 vouchers so that people can remain in their homes. Because even though we have a moratorium on evictions, my concern is the moment we begin to lift the lockdown, there could be a wave of evictions. And so we need rental assistance to families that are falling into ever deepening arrears and could be in danger of losing their homes. But at the same time, owners need rental revenues to handle the operating expenses of their buildings. So owners, like any business, should have the ability to access emergency grants or emergency lending that have been available to businesses in general.
Okay, so we are out of time. I want to respect your schedule. Oh, Kenneth Romero came back and said, the problem is that $350 billion for small businesses under CARES with an additional $300 now considered by Congress is not enough. The number of businesses that received the loan under the original stimulus are not even 10% of the 4 million small businesses in the US. It's simple math. So yeah, I don't know that you have an answer to that.
No, he's right. There's no question. I mean, even though $2.2 trillion represents the largest stimulus package in American history, it falls dramatically short of the need. Right? We're facing, I mean, keep in mind that a decade worth of job creation has vanished in the span of a few weeks. Like 22 million people lost their jobs in a single month. The Great Recession in 2008 wiped out 26 million jobs over the course of several years. We've seen the loss of more than 20 million jobs in a matter of weeks. So the speed and the depth and the breadth of the recession is unlike anything we've ever seen. And without a massive infusion of funding from the federal government, families and businesses are going to struggle to survive. So I could not agree more. We need more funding that actually reflects the need. But the funds have to be distributed based on cost of living. New York City has to receive its fair share, because whether it's on hospitals or public transit or funding in general, we have been receiving far less than our actual need. I mean, take the MTA. The MTA accounts for 38% of all transit trips in the United States, but only receive 15% of the funding allocated to transit systems throughout the United States. So I think who's ever negotiating these packages needs to keep in mind the interest of New York City.
Can we end on something positive? Is there anything positive that we have? Any organizations doing extraordinary work that we can highlight? I will highlight an organization called Conscious Kitchen in Marin County in California, which is Erin Schrody, our board vice chair's organization. She's in partnership with the renowned chef and humanitarian Jose Andres and the World Central Kitchen. Erin actually ran the World Central Kitchen in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and now she has opened a Conscious Kitchen that just this weekend celebrated 10,000 meals being distributed to Marin County residents who are facing food insecurity. So Conscious Kitchen will be on our list of organizations that you can support after this. There are many others. Ritchie, if you have any favorite organizations on either mental health, food insecurity, I know it sounds like in New York City, things are pretty under control, but on a national level, if you have any thoughts.
No, we can always use more. There are not-for-profits like Met Council, the Food Bank of New York, City Harvest that are doing the heroic work of ensuring that families in need have access to food. And whatever donations you can make to those organizations, those donations have never been more critically needed.
And how can we advocate for new policies from the FDA when it comes to blood donations? Is there anything specific? I know that GLAAD and the Human Rights Campaign are working hard on this. Are there any other organizations we can support? Any messages we should be sharing? Any, particular people we should be calling?
I think it's just simply a matter of aggressive advocacy. I think the more we agitate, the greater the likelihood of affecting change, and partnering with elected officials, with advocacy organizations to exert pressure on the FDA and to send a clear message that discrimination should never be a barrier to life-saving blood donations. We have to do right by COVID-19 patients, and we have to leave homophobia as a relic of the past.
Amen. Thank you so much, as always, for being such an extraordinary ally. And leader and thinker and human being. I am so grateful to know you. I know we're 3 minutes late, but I just realized that there was one other thing I wanted to say, which is that, Zionist activists come to Zionist because they want a place where they can be, all of their authentic selves, where they can be progressive and Zionist. And in a lot of social justice spaces, it takes a lot of courage to show up as a Jew who supports Israel, even though the vast majority of Jews support Israel, even if they, don't love everything about Israeli policy. That's not what Zionism is. And we've been highlighting leaders who have stood courageously sometimes with Zionists. I know it's not always easy, but you have always led by example, and you have been such a fervent speaker and supporter on these issues. And so if you have a minute to just reflect on, being authentic, being proud of who you are, being unafraid of your identity, not being in the closet, fighting for your values and your individuality. I would love that. And I think it would mean a lot to our activists.
Whether you're LGBTQ, or whether you identify as a Zionist, all of us should be proud and open and unapologetic about who we are and where we come from. We should never renounce our core values, our core identity and history in the face of social ostracism. I have been appalled by the rising influence of BDS within quote unquote progressive circles. In my mind, there's nothing progressive about BDS. And I just, 2 quick examples, the Dyke March in Chicago and in Washington, DC, you had LGBTQ members of the pro-Israel community who were told, oh, you cannot march waving a flag featuring the Star of David. And for me, that's not an expression of pride, that's a perversion of pride, right? Telling someone you cannot be who you are, you cannot celebrate your identity and your history, that to me is profoundly evil. That is a portrayal of the inclusive spirit of progressivism. And not only do I want no part of it, but I want to create a counterweight to that kind of exclusionary, distorted vision of progressivism. And that's precisely what Zionist embodies. I'm such an admirer of you and just the role that you've played in sending a powerful message that there's no contradiction between support for Israel and progressive values. Quite the opposite. And I'm just proud to be an honorary member of Zionist.
You are an actual member of Zionist. There's no honorary here. I also just think, for the advancement of all of the issues that we care about, everything we've talked about today, everything we're talking about in all of these conversations that we're having with the social differencing series, we're stronger together, for real. We can't push out committed activists because we have too much work to do. It is so urgent that we come together right now and fight for all of our values. And that means, the more passionate activists that want to participate, the better, in my opinion. And I know in your opinion too. And so, we got to push the bigotry. Everyone needs to push any bigotry, that's arising in any spaces that they're present in out, needs to confront it and challenge it. And you do that. And I'm very grateful.
We cannot allow BDS to set the terms of the debate, right? We can never allow the attempt to delegitimize Israel to become a litmus test within the progressive movement. That's unacceptable to me and to you and to all of us who identify as both pro-Israel and progressive, because the two are mutually reinforcing.
Thank you For people who are watching, please make sure that you sign up for our conversation on Wednesday at 5 Pacific, 8 Eastern with Rabbi Denise Egger, who is an extraordinary LGBTQ icon, the first gay or lesbian rabbi to lead the Central Conference of American Rabbis, the founding rabbi of Kol Ami congregation in Los Angeles. We are going to be doing a book club conversation on her new book, Where Pride Dwells, which is a beautiful book that's really meant so much to me as an ally of the LGBTQ community. And on Thursday, we're going to be talking to Bakari Sellers at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific, about how to protect our elections and our democratic institutions. Send questions in advance for either of those to about@zionist.org, and make sure you register at zionist.org/events. Please also feel free to support us with a tax-deductible contribution. We need your help. And also please share everything Zionist with your friends and family, because our power is in our collective voice, and the more people we can speak for, the more strength we have as a movement. Ritchie, you are amazing. Thank you so much for everything you do. I'm so grateful for your friendship on top of your amazing leadership.
Well, I'm grateful for your friendship. Thank you, Amanda.
Take care, everyone.